Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson.
Hello, I'm Diane Hartshorn.
And we have two very fun guests
Yeah,
tonight. But before we get to them,
excited.
we want to say thank you to everybody who attended Beyond the Grave this past weekend or by the
Last
time this
weekend.
episode comes
Yeah.
out a couple weekends ago,
Yeah.
October 3rd and 4th. We had so many of you were listeners that came out for the event here in Colorado and from other states. We found out you guys came to Colorado to see us, which blows our mind a little bit.
Yeah. Just a bit.
But thank you, because by coming to that event, you are supporting the preservation of both Evergreen and Fairview cemeteries in Colorado Springs, which, as we've stated before, are the two historic cemeteries located there. And as we've said time and time again on this podcast, it takes a lot of funds to keep up these old cemeteries, to repair headstones, maintain some of the old plants. In Evergreen's case, the chapel is a big part of what you guys have been working on. And that chapel was built, remind me of the right date.
It was started in 1909 and completed in 1910.
Which was perfect. I was thinking of that. That's perfect, because we did for Beyond the Grave this year. The story was Phantom of the Opera, which was originally published in 1910. So we had that connection with the story. And then, of course, it was the 100th anniversary of Lon Chaney's 1925 silent film, A Phantom. And we were able to honor that as well with our event this year. So that was all kinds of fun. So thank you again to everybody who came out and saw it. If you weren't able to come see it, you're out of state or even in state and didn't get a chance to buy tickets because it sold out so quickly, we are going to have it available in the audio form and with pictures on YouTube on October 30th. So the day before Halloween, we'll have it. That will be our Halloween episode this year. So you'll get to hear the actors do their story, their part of the story, and we'll have all that for you. And of course, if you go to our YouTube channel now, we did post the silent film that we made, our version, to honor Lon Chaney and his life. So it's an 8-minute little film, and you can watch that.
Okay, I need to correct you on that. It was not a we. Jenny did this film, and it was incredible. So if you haven't had a chance to watch it, y'all need to watch it.
That was my lesson in how to try and make something new look old for 8 minutes.
It was good.
But
it was really good.
I also have to give credit to Jeremy. He was the actor who portrayed Lon Chaney for us. And he and I got together on a Tuesday night, and he filmed all kinds of crazy stuff for me. Like we were just like, do this, and then obviously there's a lot of things we cut that didn't make it into the film, but I think he had a lot of fun trying to portray Lon Chaney. So that was fun.
It was very good.
All right, so let's move on to today's topic. We have two guests who are excited to join us, and we're excited to have, because this is a slightly lighter topic than we've had in our recent episodes with our other guests. Today, we're going to talk about cast iron grave markers, specifically some that are in Vermont. And so we want to welcome to the show Miles McCallum and Nick Brown. Thank you guys for contacting us, for one, and reaching out to us, and for joining us today.
It's so nice to be here. It's so nice to meet you. I'm Miles.
Yeah, and I'm Nick. Thank you guys so much for having us.
Oh, we're super excited. And this is one of those topics that I don't think gets studied enough and talked about enough. So my first question to you guys is, what even got you interested in these particular grave markers, and then making this an entire study for your program at school? Like, you're writing papers on this and doing all this research.
That's what I was going to ask you real quick. How old are you two?
I'm 24
and I'm 28. Yeah.
Okay, because most people we run into are at least 3 times as old as you are. So I think it's really, 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 really cool that you guys are of this age and are interested in this. So just in case where people couldn't see you, I wanted them to know that how old you are.
You guys are, which school are you attending?
So I'm a master's student at the University of Vermont.
Okay.
Nick is out of school now.
Yeah.
I kind of figured at 28, but so again, what led you guys to even pick this up as a topic to even begin studying and looking into?
Yeah, it was honestly just very natural sort of exploration and curiosity. I was in a cemetery, just sort of exploring in northern Vermont in Franklin County. and came across a grave that really stood out from across the way. I was like, what is that? And I made my way across and noticed that John Munsell, and I was like, who, did a little bit of research, couldn't find anything on the person, but I took a picture of the grave, kind of couldn't find anything online about, any academic articles or anything about cast iron graves in this style. And sort of put it down, and it was out of my mind for like 6 months or so. Didn't talk to anybody about it, didn't mention it, just sort of like this weird oddity. And then about 6 months later, I was in a different cemetery in Williston, Vermont, which is just outside of Burlington, and found a very similar looking grave. And I was like, wow, I again, like, had never seen these outside of Vermont, or had I really ever come across anything like this. So stumbled across one, and then like I looked over the hill and I was like, oh, that's another one. Okay, there's two in this cemetery now. So I'm like, started seeing this pattern emerging. And as it was me and a friend, as we were looking at the back of one of these graves, we found a maker's mark. And that was what sort of like tipped us off to this whole kind of rest of this project, was that there was a historian who wrote kind of a paper. How long ago was it that he wrote it?
2008 is when it was published.
2008, yeah, that covers very similar looking graves in New Hampshire, just over the river from Vermont. And that sort of sent us down this path of trying to understand why these things were made, where they might have been made. And then inevitably I kind of caught the bug of trying to find these things. And so we've been voyaging all over Vermont trying to find them, and have visited well over 350 or 400
Wow.
cemeteries at this point,
Yeah.
trying to just track these things down. And yeah, that's, I guess, the origin point of them. So
I love that. Yeah, these, when most people, when they think of a cemetery, they think of a headstone that's made out of stone of some kind. But there are plenty of other options, and there have been in the past. So, and the cast iron is one. We've talked about the white zinc monuments before. That's another one that we find. But yeah, the cast iron is really interesting because of the way they're made, and also kind of their origins. So if you guys are on YouTube with us, you can see behind me, I've actually got pictures that Nick and Miles included in the paper they were writing, and I swiped them out of their paper. But these are two examples of what they were finding in Vermont, of the very Gothic looking markers. And then behind Dianne, these are cast iron markers that I have found in Colorado in different cemeteries. I think the two that are behind me are probably older, but again, it's a different sort of art form for marking graves. From the research that I've done, and I haven't done nearly the extensive research that the two of you have done on these, but from what I've done, it is for some areas it's more affordable than stone. And because if it's cast iron, especially because you're making a mold to cast it, you can mass produce them more easily in some cases. So what were you guys discovering? And again, we were talking, the ones that I found, or at least two of them, are definitely Catholic markers. What were you guys finding, and what has led to those particular markers, especially in Vermont, even New Hampshire? The cast iron is not necessarily something you're thinking of back there.
Yeah, and I mean the material, I think, far and away is the most interesting, or one of the most interesting aspects of these grapes. I think it's funny. One of the things that immediately comes up as I brought this up with like friends and family are jokes about cooking eggs on them right away. Is like the first, ethics aside.
On that really hot day in the cemetery.
Right,
Fry
exactly.
your eggs.
So, it's interesting. You find periods of cast iron. You find cast iron being used in different periods in the United States, across the country, usually when a region is starting to industrialize, right? So I know that's true of I believe cast iron caskets in sort of Tennessee and the Central South around the 1840s, which is actually contemporaneous with our graves of study. So these cast iron graves in Vermont and New Hampshire seem to mostly have been produced in the 1840s and 1850s, so antebellum. And I think really what it reflects is a industrializing New England, right? So over the course of the late colonial period and the early American Republic, you see more and more iron foundries and blacksmith shops opening across New England, right? And as iron becomes a material that's just more available, people find ways, especially to use excess pig iron at places of production, at iron mines, right? To make an extra profit. And so that includes stoveware and kettleware would be big things that iron foundries and iron mines, especially in rural locales, would
Right.
produce, basically to fill gaps where the market isn't providing for those things because they're so far removed from urban centers. And
Mhm.
that's kind of our hypothesis about where these graves are emerging out of, is that they too are basically a sort of extra product that at these sites of production people can make, and that they were sold. They were actually, I think that these were produced to signal wealth, right? To
Mhm.
look like they were expensive, right? Because they're iron, but that they were actually sold at a discount, that they would have been cheaper than traditional marble and granite slabs.
And that's
Right.
so interesting because they probably last, well, we know they, yeah, we do know they last longer than and hold up longer than a lot of marble and not granite so much, but definitely the marble headstones that would be from that same period.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of marble ones that they sugar and they weather away so
Mhm.
much more quickly. Whereas, I mean, if these markers have been around since 1840s, 1850s, you
Yeah.
can still actually, even
Amazing.
with the really rusty one, you can still probably read that inscription when you're right there. So you know who's there. Um, and I have to, we see a lot of, well, not as much anymore, but there were a lot of cemeteries for a long time that used cast iron fences around the
Mhm.
entire cemetery, but also around plots. And then a lot of those fences disappeared during World War II because they were
Mhm.
recycling that iron for the war effort, which so that I always get excited when I come across a cemetery that still has original cast iron fences that they didn't
Yes.
use. I mean, I get it. We needed the metal, but at the same time, it's kind of like, oh, good, this is still here and intact. I'm
Yeah.
hoping that this didn't happen to people's grave markers, though, that the markers themselves at least got left.
Right. We hope so as well, but it is a very real question of like, we don't know how many of these things were produced. Because just like you're saying, during times of war, during times of economic downturn, right, smelting down iron would have been a very attractive prospect.
Mhm.
One thing that we've even hypothesized too is, we live in Burlington, Vermont, sort of a regional college town. And we've thought like, they're kind of spectacular and remarkable graves, right?
Mhm.
And so they could be targets of theft as well,
True.
right? In the context of Burlington, maybe that's, fraternity brothers goofing around or something, but so it's really difficult to know how many of these graves were produced in the 1840s, 1850s. We've discovered 55 in Vermont. That's how
That's
many.
incredible
That's
that
so cool.
they're so rare
Yeah,
Yeah,
Now
because they
you were
are
1,000
gorgeous.
graves. Yeah.
you
yeah.
were saying that on one of the graves that you guys looked at, you found a maker's mark. Um, did were you find do many of them have the maker's mark? It's just like a traditional stone one. Some of them have them and some of them don't. And so I know those of us that look at the stone ones get all excited when we find the maker's mark because we're like, oh, good, now we
Yeah.
can figure out who carved this and maybe why they carved it. Um, when you found the maker's mark, were you able to find out more about the foundry it came from or who made it or why they were making them in that case?
Yeah, so the Maker's Mark, and this actually relates to earlier we mentioned there's one article that we've been able to find that have been written about these graves, and that came from this individual, William Lowenthal in New
Mhm.
Hampshire. Um, and so he basically surveyed this area west of Concord, New Hampshire, around the Hillsborough area. He found a total of 18 of these Gothic cast iron style graves in New Hampshire. And and this is really notable. He traced them all to these two individuals, Greenleaf and Newman. And those are the maker's plates that are on the back of, as far as I can tell, most of them in New Hampshire, or at
Mhm.
least a significant enough amount that he felt confident that they were all produced by Greenleaf and Newman. We have found only one cast iron grave in Vermont that has a maker's plate, and that's the one that Nick mentioned earlier. And that one is also of Greenleaf and Newman.
Huh.
Um,
Not that it would have been hard to transport it across state lines in this case, but
but strangely enough, that's the only one that we've found that has a maker's plate. And so there's a very real question of um, were these all produced by the same Greenleaf and Newman, by the same New Hampshire duo, expanding into a different market into Northwest Vermont? Or alternatively, did the mold was the mold brought by one of them from one iron foundry to another? The mold falls into another person's hands, and then that person moved to northwestern Vermont. We're unsure. We're unsure.
And I think just to note that I think, railroad would have made, if this was coming around in 1853, 54, 55,
Yeah.
railroad would have been starting to pick up and been able to move goods from Western New Hampshire to Northwest Vermont over a period of time. But the Green Mountains still acted as a major barrier to commerce and travel. And it would have been uh, harder to imagine, I think, that easier flow of goods the way that we have now from Vermont and New Hampshire. So I think our theory continues to be that there's these foundries sort of cropping up that we're making these all in a sort of different pockets of places as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to speak to that yet.
Yeah, I mean, the final note that I would make on the maker's plate that we would be amiss not to mention is that Lowenthal, his study in New Hampshire, so he finds all of these cast iron graves produced by a Greenleaf and Newman around the Hillsborough, New Hampshire area. And then he, in conversation with a colleague, hears that she has also found these cast iron graves in New Hampshire, but not in the Hillsborough area, about 60, I think he says 60 road miles to the east, right near the border, Danville, New Hampshire, right near the border with Massachusetts. And he finds 3 graves there off of her advice that have a maker's plate of a D. French of Haverhill, Massachusetts.
Oh,
So we do
Massachusetts.
know that it was more likely that it's a mold that multiple iron foundries had that sort of moved around the New England area. But we don't know where the mold originates from. We don't know if the mold was like purchased from like a major firm in Boston or New York City. We don't know. Avenues for further research.
What was the age of the monuments? How long of a span do you think that they were used?
Yeah. Yeah, so it seems likely that 1853 to 1855, nearly all of these would have been produced in this just very short 3 year
2 years or 3 years of production.
That's really all we've been able to find in terms of evidence of nearly. And do you want to speak a little bit to people purchasing graves for their loved ones? Because we find a little bit of inconsistency with death dates, but we think still 1853, 54, 55.
Yeah. So basically, a majority of these graves have death dates in those 3 years, 1853, 1854, and 1855, right? We do not have a statistically significant argument as of yet, right? But the trend that I've seen as we've been going through these is that it seems like there's a disproportionate amount of children's graves and deceased spouses. So what you'll find is you'll find one of these cast iron graves next to a marble or granite, mineral headstone, and you'll see that they were a married couple and that the mineral headstone, the person may have lived another decade or 2 decades after the cast iron one. So my kind of working theory is that these were largely bought by people for loved ones who had passed away.
And I think kind of to that point, like you'll find people with death dates of like the 1840s or sometimes even as early as the 1830s, but it's people replacing marble headstones that would have been carved and then creating new headstones in cast iron and then using those to replace old headstones.
And what a cool idea.
To give you an idea, we've found graves that have death dates as early as 1802. These graves were certainly not produced in
Oh,
1802.
Right.
Right? So you have to sort of have a discerning hand in parsing through the data that we get from the death dates on these graves.
And there's always the likelihood too, because and this still happens in the modern era, that maybe the family couldn't afford a marker initially. And later down the road, they're like, oh, now we can finally put a marker on the grave, and we have this option of this cast iron marker. And I'm almost wondering, and maybe you came across something in your research. So with white zinc monuments, they were only popular for a very short time. And again, it was sort of the same era, and they were definitely more affordable. They last a long time. You could
yeah.
order the different panels for different family members at different times, but they became unpopular because Victorians decided they just weren't nice enough. Like, it wasn't, stone was better, and the Victorians had their preferences for a lot of things, and when it came to, especially if you were wealthier and stuff, you needed to stay with whatever was current. And I almost wonder in some degree if that happened with iron markers, if that's why there's such a short time span with these particular ones, as gorgeous as they are. If someone in society started this thing saying, oh, if you're doing that, you're being too cheap, and you don't really, you need a stone marker if you want to show that you have any sort of class.
This is something that we both talked about, is like the fad kind of nature of this, how it sort of seems to have come into history, peaked for a very short time, and then largely gone out of history. Because we can't find anything on them from that time period either. We've scoured newspapers and archives from like the Vermont newspaper archive and stuff, and there's really not much of a mention of these anywhere. So I think that we've as we've been looking for more data on sort of I guess like yeah why these were chosen for such a short time. One of the interesting things that we've come across is actually in that photo that you have behind you. There's a kind of a small circular daguerreotype frame for photographs that people were using it right around that time, as sort of a new technology emerging. And this goes to what Miles was saying earlier about how it seems like in sort of proto-industrial areas, or areas that were just beginning to industrialize, there were sort of these new kind of fashionable technologies that were sort of coming into vogue right during that middle 1850s period before the Civil War. And it seems like that there was sort of this fusion of those two things in these graves that for a very short time, yeah, was popular, but then, as you said, maybe there was just some sort of cultural or social
Well,
kind of took over.
and I don't think the war helped any either.
Right.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Civil War would have taken away from making cast iron markers, because they would have been using it to make ammunition
Other
and stuff
things.
instead. But I think it's fascinating that they did them for such a short time. Now, we have found, like I said, all the pictures behind Dianne, those are all in Colorado cemeteries. So cast iron it's been used across the country. And when I was doing the little bit of research I've done on it, it was a popular form of markers in certain parts of Europe. And it was more of an art form for them in sort of in the like Transylvania sort of area, that kind of area, for a long time. And it was part of that culture to do the cast iron. And I guess, and I haven't been to any of those cemeteries, unfortunately, but I guess they have a lot more of them. So, and it was an art form, although it wasn't always cast iron. Sometimes it was, what's the other form of iron working? I can't think of what it's called.
Oh,
I'm sorry, what was that?
wrought iron.
Wrought iron. Thank you. A lot of those are wrought iron, like the wrought iron crosses and stuff, where they're forming it and they're not using a mold. It's all free form, and they're forming it with their hands. So that's the difference between the cast and the wrought iron,
Right.
even if it's the same type of thing. But these Gothic looking ones I love, just because, again, they remind me of the chapels and the churches that you find across Europe. And of course, in the 1850s and 60s, it was a very fashionable thing to go to Europe and travel these locations. And so to come home and be like, yes, I want my grave marker to look like one of those places, I think is kind of cool.
Well, and like the two that are behind Jenny, they're pretty much almost carbon copies of each other. but one is definitely, I'm assuming, is very rusted. And since there are so few of them, is there any preventative maintenance or care going in to preserve them?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Our understanding is that there's no specific effort to preserve iron graves in Vermont yet. There will be.
Yeah.
Um,
Right,
but
yet.
but what you do find in Vermont, which I don't know a lot about this outside of New England or even just outside of Vermont, but we actually often have pretty active cemetery commissions in local
Mhm.
towns. And because Vermont puts such a heavy emphasis on local and municipal government, um, I feel sort of this maybe culture or just sort of social notion that it's important to sort of play a role in sort of some of these activities locally. And I think that our cemetery commissions can be very robust, especially in some of the towns where we found these. And I think that like some of the examples that have been like Little Douglas, for example, which I think is one of the ones behind you, is very well preserved. It's in Stowe. And I think that what we found is that especially outside of Franklin County, many of the towns where these have been found have been towns with substantial amounts of wealth and cemetery commissions that have been more active generally. So my guess is that similar to any headstone, the ability for many, many years of people working to help preserve these has kept them maybe more vibrant in certain places in Vermont and less vibrant in others, basically.
And it's really interesting the range of conditions that these graves are in that we've found. There are a lot of different ways that different cemetery associations very clearly attempt to keep them erect in the ground once they've fallen, right? So we've found these where half of the grave is sunk into the ground, where a third of the grave is sunk to the ground. We found these graves where there's concrete poured, right? New concrete poured in order to keep them erect. We found spray painted graves.
Ah,
Very clearly in good faith, like it's a
right.
uniform
Oh, to be
code,
like
right?
Rust-Oleum or something. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, so the range of condition is huge.
Yeah,
It's huge.
definitely.
Do you know how these are set in the ground? Are they just like long, flat, like kind of like the military markers where it's all one thing and it's super long and they put it in the ground and you're done? Is that kind of how these are? Or do they have any sort of like base to them when they put them in the ground? Do you happen to know? I don't know if you guys saw any of that.
So this actually gets into a really important point, and I want to loop it back around to what you were describing earlier, Jenny, about like European influences. So the Gothic cast iron graves that are behind you, we know were originally affixed into the ground with actually very shallow metal poles. Lowenthal, the scholar in New Hampshire, he finds that they're only like 2 to 3 inches,
Oh, wow.
Oh,
incredibly
wow.
shallow, which again feeds into this question of just how many of these things have survived, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how many have been lost to time. Now, only 25 of the 55 graves that we've found have been of that Gothic style, because we actually have found another type of cast iron grave that we haven't been able to find anywhere online or anywhere in any of the academic literature either, that is of a more Greco style. And I want to come back to this question of style because it has to do with what Nick was describing and what you were describing with fads and European influence. To answer your question, those Greco grave markers are more similar to the military ones. So in the Milton Village Cemetery in Vermont, there was a Greco marker that was totally loose from the ground. So it was actually, in terms of the condition of the cemetery, it was a shame. But in terms of us as scholars, it was very exciting to be able to see one of these full things.
Yeah.
Right.
Seeing it in full length, about a third of it would have been in the ground.
Yeah.
Okay.
Only the top 2/3 had text.
Wow. That's a pretty good sized stone.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so, one of the big trends in grave marker literature, right, is this in the American context, anyways, is this transition from sort of colonial and early republic grave making as a sort of cottage industry, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes trace specific stone makers, specific grave makers in specific places, their apprentices, right? It's much more of sort of a folk art tradition and art craft, right?
Right.
There's a big focus in the literature on the 1830s, roughly, as being this turning point where it really turns into a commercial industry, right? In New England, we see that coincide with an industrializing New England, right?
Makes
Um,
sense.
yeah. And as part of grave making becoming more of a commercialized industry, there's a lot of inspiration coming from Europe, right? And they really love to start to draw on all of these old world styles, right? So neoclassical styles. This is when we start to see obelisks and mausoleums enter the
Mm-hmm.
cemetery landscape, right? Neo-Islamic, Neo-Greco styles. And that's exactly how we have to understand these cast iron graves and why we have these two aesthetically very different models, right? This Gothic model that is very flashy, right? Versus this Greco model that is relatively more austere. The Greco model, I think part of the reason it hasn't been documented before is because it blends in a lot more with the sort of traditional marble and granite headstones that you find in northern New England. Um, so I just think I wanted to include that note in there because you were talking about European inspiration, and I think it's important to understand that these graves emerge in part of this whole sea change, right? In
Yep.
the different and eclectic aesthetic styles that grave markers and grave marker aesthetics are now drawing from.
I love it. I think it's great.
Yeah.
I really am hoping that what the work you guys have done and the studying that you've done on this actually opens this up a little bit more, and that there's
Mm-hmm.
going to be others, especially in the New England area, because like you said, New England really does care about its cemeteries. It would be fascinating to find out more about markers in the other New England states, or even just up and down the East Coast, that are the cast iron, and maybe we can learn a little bit more about some of the foundries that chose to make them and who designed the molds. And I mean, that's some of that may be lost to history at this point. We may never know some of those answers, but it'd be kind of cool if we could make some more connections and put them all together, and say, yeah, this was just going to be
Right.
another thing that we were trying to do, as a way to commemorate our dead rather than always using stones. So I think I love these. These are great.
They're gorgeous, and my goodness, they do last. I mean, you could tell how old they are. I wish any of the stones we had, well, we don't have any stones from 1850, but the ones from like 1860s, they don't look anything that you can hardly read them, or they've just like Jenny says, sugar, or just totally,
we
there's
have a
nothing
lot of the
left to
red
them.
sandstone
Yeah.
markers that are
Yeah, we have a
just,
lot of sandstone
we
that
can't even tell what they were at one point. They're just like lumps of red
blobs. Yeah.
sandstone now. They've
Right.
lost everything. Um, and that's just due to the natural elements over the years and the weathering and everything. But I do like the way the cast iron, even like I
Yeah,
said,
me
even the
too.
rusty ones, you can still read them.
Yeah.
And you can still know who's buried there, and then maybe find their stories, which is cool. Um, but I'm so glad that you guys decided to like
Yeah,
dig into
this
this
is
and
really
look more
cool.
into these particular types of markers, because they are so unique, and we're not seeing them in every single cemetery everywhere. But you definitely found the trends, I think, within the local communities of who was trying to use them at the time, and stuff, which I think is really cool. And it's a great start to just our whole story of cemeteries, and what we do to commemorate our loved ones when they die. So I think this is awesome.
And how special each one is, because each one has something very, very unique. And then if there's only, what'd you say, 50? How many have you found?
Yeah, 55.
About
Yeah.
55. 55 out of how many headstones, little along just in that part of the country?
Right.
I mean, just how rare they are and how special, and they definitely need to be documented and hopefully something to preserve them
And
for future generations.
I love that note because it really is so one thing that we should note too here is how helpful the website Find a Grave has been,
Mhm.
which I'm sure all of us are familiar with as
It's a
cemetery
great tool.
enthusiasts, right? Um, because basically our sort of methodology involved Nick got like the downloaded the Google map of Vermont, right?
Yeah.
And we sort of had parameters of what cemeteries we were looking for, right? So going for cemeteries with about 100 or more grave markers in them, right? Making sure that they're within our time period. We don't want cemeteries that are too new, right?
Right.
But that even within being able to create those narrowed search parameters and doing, there are just so many cemeteries around northern New England, old hidden cemeteries that are out of the way. We've marked down ones that when we got there, they were inaccessible, whether because they were on private property or because roads were no longer clear roads to get there were no longer maintained. Um, which is just to say that we have 55, but we really don't know. We know that there are more out there that we haven't found.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sure. Uh, did one other question I was thinking of, and maybe you guys didn't look into this, but did you look into like the families that were purchasing these, using these, did they have similar lifestyles, similar income, similar businesses that they were involved in, or were they kind of scattered across the board as to like what they were
They
doing?
were, yeah.
I'm just curious because I'm kind of curious to know if like it was like it started with one community where they were thinking, oh, we like this style, and then it passed it on, or if it was just across the board, somebody said, nope, I really like this new fad, and let's try it. So I didn't know if there was like a difference in that, or if you guys looked into that side of it yet.
It's a great question. We don't really have a complete answer to it. Nick noted in the beginning, we've really found that they're mainly Anglo names. That they're essentially all in village cemetery plots or small family plots. We found one in an Episcopalian cemetery. I don't think we found any in any Catholic cemeteries. And that's sort of, something that's always of interest to grave marker scholars and grave marker enthusiasts, right? Are ethnic cleavages, right? And how you can learn about communities,
Mhm.
their burial practices, and for Vermont in that period, that would be Catholic French Canadians, right? And we've only found one French surname out of all of the graves we found.
Yeah.
We found one Dutch surname as well. And aside from those two, they all seem to be of English.
Huh, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, in the French last name, I believe it was not Anglicanized. Am I right in saying?
Yeah, correct,
So it
correct.
could have been someone actually from France, potentially, that where the name had not been changed when they came from
I
Canada.
feel like, I mean, maybe I'm generalizing things. I just feel like it might be something that would have some French influence with, I mean, when you think about like in America, if you go down to Louisiana, there's a lot of things that are made in iron down there. And there is sort of that French influence
Mhm.
down there. And it's interesting that that's not really where this came from in Vermont. Like it, even though you had that culture, that's not what led to these particular grave markers being made. So I think that's very interesting. I like that though.
I'll throw in one final twist that is very exciting for us and is, I think, probably one of our biggest avenues for future research, which is that we officially can now confirm that we've found two of the Greco style of cast iron
Hey,
graves in Canada, in Quebec, just north of the border from Vermont, right? So
Huh.
sort of New England regional question has turned into an international one.
yay.
But those two graves are still Anglo names.
Yeah.
And that kind of gets into actually a whole history of this part of Quebec, the Eastern
I
townships,
think
right?
lower township.
Lower
Maybe
townships.
that's what it is.
the exact sort of historical name for the area is escaping me. But basically, a lot of loyalists during the American Revolutionary War resettled in southern Quebec, and so we think of Quebec as a French-speaking place, and it is a French-speaking place today. But actually, throughout the 19th century, really there were these shared English-speaking communities in northern Vermont and southern Quebec. That exchanged goods, families moved back and forth, right, and were extended over the border. And that's what these graves we found in Canada so far, at least that's our working theory, sort of on what they reflect, which is how porous that border actually was in the 19th century.
So
Oh, that's interesting.
is this something the two of you are going to continue to study and pursue, or are you moving on to other things?
No, I think no, this is something that we've been continuing to plug away at, and we're working on, as you mentioned earlier, that paper to get that published as well. We do have an Instagram handle. We're just Iron Grave Society on Instagram,
Perfect.
where we're able to receive DMs if folks have other places where they're able to locate these, and then ideally over time, our hope is to kind of build up a little bit of a society to get people organized and get out and preserve these things because I think if we can find people across Vermont and northern New England who are just as excited as the folks on this podcast or folks listening on this podcast, we might be able to get people together to actually make sure these things are preserved and safe over a long period of time.
And this is a good opportunity to plug too that we're very grateful for this coming spring. We're going to be the keynote speakers for the Vermont Old Cemetery Association annual spring meeting. And so we want to say that, we're getting this effort started, but also we want to extend thanks to the Vermont Cemetery Association community that has already started to welcome us and that we're, hoping to bring energy and a specific knowledge base for these graves. But that it's a long-standing community of people that we're engaging with.
Yeah.
That's very cool. So have you researched much of the individuals that have these stones?
No, I think we have basic demographic information sort of figured out at this point, just so that you have sort of a spread of some of that stuff to be able to draw some kind of higher
Yeah, I'm just curious if there might be some kind of connection between all of them, that since there are only so very few of those, well, there could have been a heck of a lot more headstones, but so very few remaining, if there is some kind of connection with people, whether it's religious or where they came from or, something.
Yeah, and Lowenthal, he does that work in his paper to connect everybody, in New Hampshire seemingly to Greenleaf and Newman.
Yeah.
There's no reason to think that there couldn't be similar connections as well in Vermont.
That's actually such a huge note that Nick brings up. So this scholar in New Hampshire, he basically puts together this argument that all of the graves he finds in New Hampshire, in the west of Concord, in the Hillsborough area, that they're actually all familially connected to the people that he thinks are the same Greenleaf and Newman on the graves. He never finds a smoking gun of we are Greenleaf and Newman and we make cast iron graves. He's hypothesizing based on very sort of scant records that he's able to put together. So that's sort of how he interprets it as a fad, right? Is that actually this was a fad that ran through this specific network of families in New Hampshire. We haven't found that yet. Yeah. And I would say that my working hypothesis, like my working answer to that question right now, is that I don't think that all of these people would have been related familially.
Okay.
I think that you probably see more of a market dynamic going on in northwestern Vermont, where these are being. Yeah.
No, I think that's.
I'm just curious because you just never know because there's just so few of them.
I was going to say, in your research, have you come across any like actual advertisements for these markers? I've been looking for advertising, not even just specifically for yours, but like for anything that's not stone, because there's plenty of advertisements for stone markers historically all over the place, but trying to find like the cast iron or the white zinc, sometimes those are a lot harder to come across. So I was wondering if you'd come across any of that.
No, we haven't. We haven't. We have found newspaper excerpts. Nick was
Okay.
talking about this earlier with some of the Vermont. We found newspaper excerpts, including in the Green Mountain Freeman from Montpelier. It was some
Yeah.
Montpelier-based newspaper. Um, some newspapers, actually, funnily enough, a lot of newspapers in the 1840s reprinted excerpts that said
Hmm.
that Cleveland, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, were places where cast iron markers started to be used, where they started to come into vogue. Um, so that's one sort of documentary place that we found mention of these graves. No ads. And the other thing that I would add is that we have not found any patents for these graves, which
Exactly.
is very strange. Cast iron caskets, cast iron grave covers, most other cast iron mortuary accoutrement, there are patents for, but there are no patents for these
Huh.
molds. So,
I think so. I was telling you before we started recording, somebody else had reached out to me about a cast iron grave they had come across in a cemetery they were working in. And I think that was one of the questions. And when I started to try and help them research some of it, I couldn't find any advertisements. I couldn't find any patents. And I was looking for all of that. And so that's why I asked, because they are the one that you would think this seems to be with these particular grave markers. And it feels like it might be true across the country wherever they've been used. It's almost more of a word of mouth type thing. Like, hey, if you want a more affordable grave marker that's still really classy looking, you can get these cast iron ones from, whichever foundry is nearby or whoever's making them. But it doesn't seem like it was a well advertised, marketed item. And so I find that I'm glad you guys are not the only ones who have not been able to find anything, because I have not been able to find anything in anywhere. Now, granted, I haven't been to all 50 states and I haven't looked through all the stuff, but I have, even online in the different databases that I can get to, I have found nothing saying these are, buy this, or, so often when the railroads started crisscrossing the country and everything was in a catalog. You could order anything
Hmm.
out of a catalog, but I am not finding these markers in the catalogs. So I thought that was very interesting. And I was like, I needed to ask you guys that, because again, I'm trying to figure out how these became. I mean, enough people knew about them to use them, but we're not seeing like this big push for them either through advertising or other things.
And it's interesting because to note that the localism and the regionalism of it, like we're finding these predominantly in Northwest Vermont right now. And I went over Lake Champlain to check out some of the Clinton County cemeteries on the New York side of the lake. Not really nothing so far since we've been able to like look over that way. And it is interesting to think about again, sort of these geographic regions that get broken down because of features like Lake Champlain or the Green Mountains, and how geographic isolation also might have been part of the reason why these things became, popular in
Right.
particular areas. Just another, yeah.
yeah, and and this is totally me getting way too excited about the two graves in Canada that we've found. But I'm wondering too if the Gothic model does originate maybe with Greenleaf and Newman in New Hampshire. Maybe they get the mold from some firm. But I'm wondering if the Greco model that we found actually originates from Canada and then
Hmm.
moves southward over the border. It's important to keep in mind that the political boundaries that we see and experience today are
Mhm.
not what those in the 1840s and 1850s would have seen and experienced. And so it's important to think about these geographic features, to think about when did canals start to emerge where? When did railroads start to emerge where? And in the case of northern Vermont, it's true that for a long time, actually, the Montreal would have been the closest big city that you would have
True.
sold goods upriver to, right?
Yeah.
So it's important to stay critical and to challenge maybe some of the geographic assumptions that we would otherwise just make, and try to think about what was the world that these graves were produced in like.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating. Oh, I'm excited that you guys are doing this. And
Yeah.
I look forward to watching as you guys find more information and do your research. And I think the Cemetery Society is in for a treat this spring when you guys are their keynote speakers. That's going to be so exciting. So definitely keep us informed as you guys are discovering more stuff. And if you learn anything really awesome, let us know, because we would be happy to have you back to share it.
Well, thank you so much for having us. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about today's episode, visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you'll find additional links in our show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your support helps others find our show and discover all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
You can also follow us on social media for cemetery facts, photos, quotes, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery. If you'd like to help support us financially, you can donate a cup of coffee by clicking on the coffee cup icon on our website or YouTube, or purchase some of our fabulous Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery merchandise through our store link.
Until we meet again.